Isn't it wonderful to be here? My name is David Trulio, and it is my privilege to be the President and CEO of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Now, before we get started with the program, I will recognize some people in the audience with us today. So from the Reagan Foundation Board of Trustees, we have Michael Castine, right there, Andrew Littlefair, Peggy Noonan, and Governor Pete Wilson and his wife, Gail. Quick round of applause. And from the Reagan family, we have granddaughter Ashley Reagan Dunster and her husband, Joe Dunster. And also from the Reagan family, we are pleased to have Dennis Ravel, husband of the late Maureen Reagan. In addition, we have the former governor of Mississippi, Haley Barbour. Where is Governor Barbour? Okay, and we have the mayor of Simi Valley, Fred Thomas. Mayor Thomas, there he is. City manager of Simi Valley, Samantha Argabright, right next to the mayor, which makes sense. And former congressman from this district, Elton Gallagly, and his wife, Janice. There you go. We also have Stuart McLaurin, president of the White House Historical Association. Where's Stuart? There he is. Stuart is very humbly sitting in the back, but he is quite a force, and we're very grateful that he's here today. Now, for their generosity in connection with events this week, special thanks to Ashley Parker Snyder, Fess Parker Wineries. Where's Ashley? There we go, right over there. And we also have special thanks for Dan Hill from Mach 1 Air Charters. Where is Dan? There we go. Okay. Next, I would like to acknowledge each and every one of you with us here today who worked for Ronald Reagan in various capacities. I ask that you please stand and be recognized. If you worked for Ronald Reagan, please stand up. Please be recognized. What a turnout. Now, it is my honor to introduce Mr. Fred Ryan, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Fred is one of those people who stood up because he served President and Mrs. Reagan since 1980 in roles including Director of Presidential Appointments and Scheduling in the White House and as President Reagan's first post-presidency Chief of Staff. In addition to being our board chairman, Fred heads our Center on Civility and Democracy, which support Ronald Reagan's vision of fostering informed patriotism, where Americans can disagree about issues without villainizing each other and can find common ground and trust in our democratic institutions. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Fred Ryan.
Thanks, Dave. Well, thank you, Dave, for that kind welcome. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's great to see so many people who have been such an important part of Ronald Reagan's life over the years. You know, when truly momentous events occur, I think we all remember where we were at that moment. And Ronald Reagan's passing, I believe, was one of those momentous occasions. We also remember the mix of emotions that washed over us when we heard the news. Sadness, certainly, that the country had lost a great leader. Relief that President Reagan had finally been freed from that arduous journey into the sunset of his life. Emptiness, an emptiness that came from the finality of knowing that we would never again see the man that we so revered. But also gratitude. Gratitude that President and Mrs. Reagan and so many people who are gathered here today had built this institution so that his work could continue, his example and his enduring principles could live on. So yes, the date gives us cause for sadness, but the enduring legacy of Ronald Reagan gives us cause for great celebration. And today, we intend to celebrate that legacy. But as we always do with the Reagan Library, we want to commemorate the legacy with purpose. And we have gathered some of the most influential voices of the Reagan administration, some of the most thoughtful minds in the media, some of the most foremost experts in foreign and domestic policy, as well as those who have written extensively about our 40th president to reflect on where the Reagan legacy stands today. Today we will reflect on Ronald Reagan's domestic triumphs, Morning in America, and we'll examine his foreign achievements, peace through strength. But there's a common thread that runs through every action, every victory of the Reagan presidency. He led with principle, he led with conviction, and he led with moral clarity. And in doing so, he provided a lesson, an example of not just how to lead a nation, but how to lead a life. President George W. Bush put it well at President Reagan's funeral, saying, "As he showed us what a president should be, he also showed us what a man should be." Ronald Reagan carried himself, even in the most powerful office, with a decency and attention to small kindnesses that also defined a good life. 20 years after he left us, it's never been more evident. On the home front, we desperately need his principled leadership. We still need his commitment to free enterprise and limited government. And on the international stage, we need his successful philosophy of peace through strength. But perhaps more than anything else, we need the power of his generous spirit. We need the reassurance of his boundless optimism. And we need the enduring example of leadership that President Reagan set. And that is why we are here. To begin the ceremonial portion of today's event, please stand for the presentation of the colors by Naval Base Ventura County. They will be led in by Pipe Major Bill Boddicker, who was an intimate part of President Reagan's funeral 20 years ago. And then please remain standing for the national anthem, sung by Voices of Freedom, and the invocation by Reverend Drew Sams of Bel Air Presbyterian, President and Mrs. Reagan's home church.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that
Would you pray with me? Almighty and Creator God, as we gather here on this hillside that you spoke into existence, we give great thanks that you are the source of all life, all goodness, all truth, all hope, and all peace. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us as we turn back to you and away from our self-sufficiency and pride. As your prophet Isaiah warned thousands of years ago, woe to all who would call evil good and good evil. We find ourselves in a confused culture that has not only lost its compass, but is also a very different nation from what it was 20 years ago. And yet you, God, have not changed. As we remember and honor our late and great President Ronald Reagan, and as we give great thanks for First Lady Nancy Reagan, we are reminded that you, loving God, were the one whom they sought counsel and guidance above all others. We thank you for the ways in which President Reagan saw his service to this nation and the world as a calling from you in which he sought to faithfully steward with boldness and humility. We thank you, God, that you grant wisdom and discernment to all who seek you. And I pray that your Holy Spirit would soften each of our hearts to turn back to you as the center and circumference of our lives. May a great revival sweep over our land that embodies the two great commandments: to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. May we find in you, Jesus, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the deep longing and satisfaction of our soul. I pray these things in the powerful and precious name of Jesus, our great Prince of Peace. And we say together, amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jamel Wright, President of Eureka College, followed by the wreath-laying at President Reagan's memorial site, including members of the Reagan family.
Please be seated. Our story begins in Tampico, Illinois, where our all-American president was born on February 6, 1911. From his parents, he learned spiritual strength, eternal optimism that all people are created equal, and love of country. His world expanded when he found his way to college in America's heartland. He fell in love with Eureka, and he described it as one of the loveliest colleges in existence, where everything good in his life began. What he gained at Eureka College was an education on the rights of humankind, along with his first experiment with politics of inspiration, realizing that his voice could be, and indeed was, in fact, influential. From the cornfields of Illinois to the film studios of Hollywood, when the call came, Ronald Reagan answered. 6 times he was reelected president of his union. A stint in corporate America exposed him to core tenets of conservatism, free market fundamentalism, anti-communism, lower taxes, and limited government. Those principles formed the basis of a speech he delivered to America called A Time for Choosing. Ultimately, America chose Ronald Reagan. First, as governor of California, he said he was just an ordinary citizen and it was time for common sense. Then, willing to lead our nation, he asked America, and we answered. His inauguration signaled a reaffirmation of historic American ideals. As a golden stream of sunlight broke through the dark sky in our nation's capital, he warmed everyone around him with faith and optimism as he talked about the shining city on a hill. These were as much a part of him as his modest smile, his humility, and his sense of humor. Ronald Reagan brought to the presidency confidence in the American experience, in the legitimacy and success of American institutions, and in the decency of the American people. Today, we celebrate the blessings that flowed from his path and his presidency. God bless Ronald Reagan, and God bless the United States of America.
mansions of the Lord. No more bleeding, no more fight, no prayers pleading through the night, just divine embrace, eternal light, to the mansions of the Lord. Where no mothers cry, no children weep, we will stand and guard, though the angels sleep. All through the ages safely keep the mansions of the Lord. All through the ages safely keep
Ladies and gentlemen, from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute Board of Trustees, Mr. Andrew Littlefair.
Good afternoon. I have the privilege of serving on the Reagan Foundation Board of Trustees. And 40 years ago, I was a staff assistant to President Reagan in the Office of Presidential Advance. It's my advance degree. It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America, and under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder, stronger, and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago? Ladies and gentlemen, that is a re-election ad that does more than win a race. It wins a landslide. The ad itself was compelling and conjured up powerful yet reassuring images that you will still remember, all of us do, 40 years later. But it wasn't the voice or the visuals that made it effective. It was effective because it was the truth. It really was morning again in America. After nearly 4 years of lowering taxes, taming inflation, reining in government overreach, and restoring faith in the American dream, we really were prouder, stronger, and better. And after 4 years, the sense of pride only grew because Americans felt their lives improving year after year. How did President Reagan achieve it all? And how should today's leaders learn from this example? Veteran journalist Ann Compton, who once covered President Reagan at the White House, is going to ask our panelists to answer those questions. Andy Card, a deputy assistant to the president and director of intergovernmental affairs under Ronald Reagan, and of course, Secretary of Transportation under George H.W. Bush and Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush. Influential economist Dr. Art Laffer served as a member of the President Reagan's Economic Policy Advisory Board, and Stephen Moore, the widely read economic advisor and commentator who served in the Reagan administration Office of Management and Budget. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage as I hand things off to the incomparable Ann Compton.
Well, hello. His inaugural was unlike any that had come before. President Ronald Reagan stood at the west front of the United States Capitol building, gazing off across the National Mall at the Washington Monument and the memorials for Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln. And his opening words, It is a commonplace occurrence, he said. The orderly transfer of authority, as called for in the Constitution, routinely takes place as it has for almost 2 centuries. He turned and thanked President Carter. In his next breath, Ronald Reagan's tone hardened. He declared inflation to be this present crisis. It threatens, he said, to shatter the lives of millions of our people. Idle industries have cast workers into unemployment, human misery, and personal indignity. Art Laffer What do you think of? This was the beginning of his 8-year mission on the U.S. economy.
Thank you very much, Ann. Let me just say that Ann is a very tough ruler. She says I had to keep it short. So I tried to explain.
You are short.
Well, I tried to explain to her I've been short all my life. Thank you, Steve, for taking my punchline. I guess what I'd like to say, Ann, if I could, is to shorten the story that usually takes me 45 minutes, but now will take me 45 seconds. We had a meeting at the Beverly Hills Hotel in 1979. Dick Allen described the history of the U.S. up until that time as being the U.S. has been harassing their friends and cajoling their enemies. And we all were laughing, and the president said, "Is that really true? Well, what have been the consequences of those policies?" And Dick Allen, who also was humorous in this response, said, "You know, sir, we have almost no friends left, but we have lots of enemies." And with that, the governor just responded quickly, "I guess we'll just have to do a 180-degree pivot on that now, won't we? We'll have to make our friends stinking rich with supply-side economics and scare the bejabbers out of our enemies with Star Wars." I'm using modern phrases for those things, but that's exactly what he said. And I knew at that moment that the U.S. had pivoted and that we just won the Third World War and created the greatest prosperity America's ever known. That's my story of the beginning of this, and it culminated in 1989 with the most successful administration this country has ever seen.
Stephen Moore, how did President Reagan make the deep engagement outside of office as well as the policies that he did? How did he proceed?
Well, what a privilege and pleasure to be here, and so I'm so appreciative of the Reagan Library for inviting me, and especially sitting next to two of my heroes, Andy Card and the great Arthur Laffer. I mean, this guy is a national treasure, right? The greatest economist we have in this country. I will just give a very, I'm much younger than these two, much younger. So, but I really, I was 27 years old when I was able to had the honor of working in the Reagan administration. It was really the last year of Reagan's presidency, and it really didn't, at the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. I was able to work, remember Jim Miller, who was the OMB director, a great guy. You knew Jim, and he hired me. And I remember one of the first things he told me when I went to work for the Reagan administration is, "Steve, let me tell you how things work around here." He said, "We don't always take the free market position." He said, "We don't always take the free market position, but it is the default position." In other words, if you're going to make a case that the free market isn't working, you better make the case of why the free enterprise system doesn't work. And I don't think there's really been a president since then that has always taken that stance. And that was really the view of, in my opinion, all of the Reagan people. They really believed, and we believed, that free enterprise works. And the more freedom you have, the better the country is. And so that was really the policy that we followed. And I started by saying, I didn't think it was really a big deal to have worked in the budget office in Reagan's last year. But now, I think it's like one of the coolest things I've done in my life, right? I mean, I'm just so proud of having served, as you said, one of the greatest presidents we've had. I'd put him in the top 5 in American history. And so that's a really cool thing. I may make one last point and then turn it over to Andy, which is, I have been blessed in my life to have really gotten to know 4 people in particular who are, really had this special aura about them. And one of them was Milton Friedman. And he was Milton Friedman part of your economic council? And another one was William F. Buckley, Bill Buckley, who really truly had a twinkle in his eye and was, a special person. And Arthur Laffer and Ronald Reagan. And all of them had a real sense of optimism about America. And I think that's one of the things that made Reagan special. He wasn't, just saying these words. He really believed in the future of the country. And in his final speech that he gave, his farewell speech, he said really something that I've always remembered, which is and I think I'm remembering this right, but I may get it not exactly word for word, but he said, they called me the great communicator, but it wasn't so much that I was a great communicator, it's that I communicated great ideas. And that was Ronald Reagan.
Thank you. We want to go through, I'd like to explore not only how he governed, President Reagan as a communicator, how he used that power, and how his impact is still felt in this country today. Andrew Card has had more jobs in federal government than anybody else I covered in my 41 years with ABC News, except George Herbert Walker Bush, Ronald Reagan's vice president. But Andy, the President Reagan organized the West Wing with a triumvirate, his two California loyal Californians and a Texan who was best friends with the vice president. Was it a good idea? Did that work the way that Ronald Reagan came into the presidency? Did he put together an operation that was effective?
President Reagan, when he was running for president, America was pretty depressed. And we were not confident of ourselves. We were challenged because policies were coming down from Washington, D.C., and they were imposed on governors and the people in their states rather than having the governors decide what was best to their states. And I watched Ronald Reagan come and outline those challenges without being negative. Instead, he was positive. He said, "It's morning in America." And we know how to address these problems. And the first thing that he said was, I'm going to organize a White House that is filled with people that might not seem to get along, but will learn how to. And he took them for their competence and their courage to speak truth to power. And yes, there were strains, but James A. Baker III ended up being one of the greatest chiefs of staff of all time. And he was not part of the Reagan team. He was invited to be part of the Reagan presidency with the Reagan team. And that ability to say, we're doing the best we can for America by hiring the best we can for America, and it's going to be a new day, and the new day will be lots of sunshine and lots of faith, but it will also be a day where people are empowered that should be empowered to help lead us, and that would be the governors. Ronald Reagan was a governor who became president. He had respect for every other governor in this country, and they had been pushed aside by policies in Washington, D.C. that at the time meant power was centralized in D.C., not among the people. So I was blessed to come to work at the White House as the liaison to the president's friends, the governors of the country. And he saw every governor as having empathetic leadership for the people in their state. And he saw Washington, D.C. with a lack of empathy for every people in every state. And so he wanted to reach out to governors, Republicans and Democrats, tall ones, short ones, skinny ones, and fat ones. And he said, I will have a relationship with you. I want to understand what you think should be done, and I'm looking forward to those laboratories of democracy that are called the states to try different things to work. And it worked. And we became much more confident as a people. Ronald Reagan was always confident because he woke up in an optimistic way every single day. And the sun was shining even if the clouds were covering it. And he was optimistic. And that optimism was contagious, and believe it or not, it infected the White House staff. The White House staff came to work with an attitude, yes, we can do it. Yes, we can find a solution. Yes, it may not be my solution, but we can find a solution. And we're going to invite solutions to come into this process. But I was also blessed because he would ask about the governors. And I would be surprised when he'd say he'd want to call a Democrat governor, and I'd say, oh, what's the matter? He says, I heard maybe he and his wife are having some troubles. I'd love to talk to him. Or another governor he'd say,
I saw that his son was giving him a tough time. Should I call him, the son, and give him an attaboy and tell him to step up? So I saw this unbelievable compassion for others that were challenged with leadership responsibility. And he said, I'm going to empower you to think what is best for your state. And America is going to be a country closer to the people than it had been, because Washington, D.C. doesn't have to be the center of all decisions and all solutions. So that was the optimism that I saw. I loved to listen to him talk to governors that I thought were his political foes, and he turned them into political allies. And it happened all around the country, state by state. He cared about them, but he also was something else. He could take very complicated documents that would be set into a very smart staff person into the Oval Office. And that staffer was very proud of all of those thousands of words that were used in that document. And the president would read the document, and then he'd say, don't you just mean this? We're going to do a better job. Yes, we're going to do a better job. The optimism was contagious. It made a difference, and it changed the world, because he also said to the rest of the world, watch us. We're the shining city on the hill. If you copy us, you're going to be empowered in your state. He celebrated democracy, created the National Endowment for Democracy, which spread democracy around the world. And boy, do we wish that we had fertilized that seed of democracy better than we did over the last 10 years.
It's not just dealing with governors, that's federalism, but what Ronald Reagan really impressed me doing is how he approached Congress. And all of you have an experience with this. It's not just the new Republican Senate. The Senate had been Democratic for 28 years, literally 3 decades. And he suddenly, with his election, brought in a Republican Senate. But what did he do about the House of Representatives, still under Democratic control? Money bills start in the House. And who did he befriend, Art Laffer?
Well, let me just say that he did work with the Congress and with Democrats and Republicans, as you say, Andy. And our first bill, of course, was the spending bill, which was, we got a Democrat who's a PhD, dear friend of mine, a guy named Phil Graham. The bill was Graham Latta in the House, which was the spending bill. Another dear friend of mine was Kent Hance, professor of economics as well. We got Hance accountable for the tax cuts. This started the ball rolling. It really started moving through the whole process. What amazed me, and if I may, is in 1986. Now think of this today. And I'm a numbers sort of guy. Reagan always would ask the question when something went wrong, don't just stand there, undo something. And that really was the motto. And the 86 Tax Act, now think of that in today's terms. We cut the highest marginal income tax rate from 50% to 28%. That a good enough cut for you? The fat cats were really happy. We raised the lowest tax rate from 12.5% to 15%. We had 2 tax rates, 28% and 15% on income. We took it from 11 tax brackets to 2 tax brackets. Just to make sure we weren't missing something in, we cut the corporate rate from 46% to 34%. You with me? And we also got rid of all these deductions, exemptions, exclusions, et cetera, in the bill. Amazing numbers there. And when you look at that bill, now imagine that bill today. It wouldn't get 1 vote in the House or the Senate today. That bill would not. In Reagan's term in '86, in the Senate that year, it was a really close vote. It was 97-3. Reagan worked with the Democrats and Republicans. There were only 3 senators. Paul Simon from Illinois, that little guy with the bow tie, remember him, walking around, blah, 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 blah. And Levin out of Michigan, you remember Levin, whoo-hoo. And then there was Merkley. I think Merkley was from Montana. We're the only 3 to vote against it. Who voted for it? Tall and pink, Bill Bradley, he voted for it. Teddy Kennedy, he voted for it. My senator and one of my dearest friends, I've done a lot of work with Al Gore. I think he's a wonderful man, a really modern day polymath. He voted for it. In fact, he told me it was the best bill he ever voted for in economics. And then we also had that senator, I can't remember his name, from Delaware. Joe Biden voted for it. You know, this was Reagan at his best. We passed the bill 97-3. It went through. This was Reagan working together to create a great America. The bill was the best bill in economics ever. That was how Reagan worked with Congress. We got them all together, and I see my dear friend Pete Wilson, and you guys are just wonderful today to see you. But that's what Reagan did, and that's how he worked it.
Steve, there's another part of this equation that's cutting government spending. And there was the Grace Commission, and talk about that end of the spectrum.
Well, look, one of the things that impressed me the most in watching, what was happening in those early 80s was that, I think you told me the story, Arthur, that, when you had one of your first Economic Policy Council meetings, Reagan said, I hate taxes, I hate inflation, I hate the Soviets. Let's just do something about that, right? And he didn't sweat the details. He had a big plan, and so we did that incredible tax bill that Arthur Laffer helped, played such a critical role on, and it cut tax rates substantially. And then, do you remember 1982? I mean, 1882 was a terrible year for the economy. It was the second year of the Reagan presidency. And everybody, you guys probably remember this, everybody's going crazy. In fact, there was a famous Washington Post editorial in the spring of 1982 that said, the first line of it was, that Reaganomics is now a spectacular failure for all of us to see. And even Republicans were panicking. Remember, you had the David Stockmans of the world and the people, this isn't working, we've got to stop, we got to raise taxes, et cetera, et cetera. And the one guy who held the line on this, who said it's going to work out, was Reagan. And even though there was enormous pressure to raise taxes. And then, this is a number that Arthur taught me, but you can look it up because it's true. In the summer of 1982, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, are you ready for this? The Dow Jones Industrial Average in the summer of 1982 was 800. 800. Today, we're at 30,000. This is the most, Reagan unleashed the greatest, most spectacular period of wealth creation in the history of civilization. And it happened not just because of the tax cuts, but a whole series of free market policies. I wish we had cut spending more. I wish Donald Trump would have cut spending more. Republicans don't have a great record on cutting spending. But one of the things that I think we all have to appreciate about what Reagan did, as soon as the rest of the world saw what was happening in the United States with this spectacular expansion, guess what the rest of the world did? They started cutting taxes themselves, right? So all over the world, not only are US taxes lower today, but almost every country in the world has lower tax rates because they could see what was happening in the United States, this unbelievable period of great prosperity. And so we exported Reaganomics throughout the world. And in fact, you could make the case that that period from 1980 to 2020 was one of the greatest periods of prosperity for the whole world, and we led by example. We led by example. So Reaganomics is still there, and what's tragic is, right now we have a president who is really trying to undo almost everything that we did that worked under Reagan is under assault right now. That's why this is a really important moment for our country. All of these things, lower taxes, less spending, less regulation, sound money, free trade, all of these things are very much in jeopardy. And that's why it's so important that we learn and relearn these lessons of the power of Reagan's ideas.
One of the most awesome powers of a president is not dollars and cents, it's not relations with states, it's the power to shape the United States Supreme Court and the federal judiciary. And if you have thoughts on his first appointment to the United States Supreme Court, a campaign promise that he fulfilled, and then the next three ones that he named. I know none of you might have been actually part of the process, but Sandra Day O'Connor had been in his sights, and it spoke a lot to the kind of decisions that he made and the kind of promises that he tried to keep. Andy?
Well, clearly he had a view that he wanted Sandra Day O'Connor on the court, and it was no secret when the process started. There was skepticism that it could happen. And I give credit to Jim Baker and Ed Meese for helping to lead the way to bring it to reality without controversy. We can't say that about a lot of other things. The other thing is I would point out is the way the White House functioned, it was before radio talk shows even had started. It was before the internet, obviously, and cell phones were bricks. But the White House had very great discipline about how it communicated, thanks to great people in the press corps, in the press office at the White House. And President Reagan was a master at making sure that we understood how the press would act, not necessarily what they would say, but how to treat the press. So I credit the press secretaries that were there, and the tension on the White House staff. Well, the best and the brightest are always hired by every president, and that should always be the case. Unfortunately, most of the people who are the best and the brightest also think their egos deserve to be best and the brightest. And President Reagan was wonderful about dealing with all of those egos, allowing the best and the brightest to come out, so that someone who was best and brightest didn't, I'm going to say, muzzle somebody else who had something else to say. He would read the audience in the Oval Office to say, I know they're thinking of something, they're not being allowed to say it because they're being looked at by somebody else, and I'm going to ask them about it. And it would make a big difference. And frequently, he would pick up and then become a cheerleader for the contrarian suggestion that had been made with some courage. So Ronald Reagan was the master at finding the right word at the right time to use and motivating you by the way he used that word. So you wanted to be part of his team and build up. So Supreme Court justice is a big deal. Let's also not forget, we celebrated the anniversary of our Constitution during the presidency of Ronald Reagan. And Chief Justice Warren Burger made a terrific job of following through on the president's expectation that we would celebrate that Constitution, and we'd make sure that there's a Constitution in every library in the country that was written in Braille, and there had never been a Braille library, a Constitution printed, and he gave us that. He celebrated things. He celebrated when the space shuttle Columbia went up, and then he mourned with us when the shuttle Challenger went down. And the way he helped lead this country through that very painful experience was also just remarkable, because it showed the compassion and the way he could communicate. And I can tell you, the trip that he took to Houston, Texas, still ranks as one of the most emotional trips that I've been on, where he met with the families that had been lost in the shuttle, the Challenger. So let's not forget the burdens that President Reagan had to carry because of his responsibility for all of us when things happened to some of us that he would never invite on any of us.
I really think it's true that as a reporter covering that era, I cannot imagine what Ronald Reagan would think of the digital age. How do you think he'd react?
How do I think he'd react? The same way I do. I don't understand.
Steve?
I have a flip phone, I don't have a computer, and I don't do emails. But other than that, I'm really hip. You know, what can I tell you?
My solution actually goes back to something that I learned from my grandmother, who was a militant suffragette, very well educated. She told me to do two things. She said, number one, taste your words before you spit them out. I would say lick your thumbs before you tweet them out. And the other one is, do not leave the room until you go out the door. Be fully present in every room where you are, so that you leave with more knowledge than you gave up.
I like that. Great. Good work on Grandma. Steve, you had mentioned that President Reagan did say that I wasn't a great communicator, but I communicated great things. I was tickled one day that I was lying in a hospital bed, and the phone rang, and a woman's voice said, Ann Compton? I said, yeah. She said, the president. And on comes the very familiar voice that said, well, you're a lousy correspondent. But he said, congratulations on the birth of your brand new baby girl, a little curled up on my lap. I was in the maternity ward. And it was a lovely call, and it was so well appreciated. I'm just a member of the press, but I was lying there, but I had just watched on television his dealing with the president of Lebanon. The American embassy that morning in Beirut had been attacked. A wide swath of the American Middle East intelligence community had been wiped out, a real crisis moment. Yet he had taken the moment to call me, and then I couldn't get him off the phone. He did like to talk, but he is. I've always thought that the communication skills were a huge element in how he was able to move the country forward. Highs points, low points in the administration. Privatization of Social Security. Would it ever have? Would it have ever gone through?
Was the question, would it have?
Social Security.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you should ask about this. I just wrote a piece with my friend Steve Forbes about this. So if we had done this back, well, I call it personal accounts. If we had just moved to a system of 401k accounts back like in the early 1980s, and there was some discussion of this under Reagan, I regard this as, well, the single greatest mistake in the last 75 years in our country clearly was the governmental response to COVID. By the way, can we all admit and agree that we should never, 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 never allow our government to shut down our economy again? Never again. Never again should they shut down our schools. Never again should they shut down our hospitals. By the way, 10 times more people died from lockdowns than died from COVID. So it was a horrible thing. But a big, huge mistake this country made was we should have done this in the early 1980s. If we had done this, I just turned 64. My Social Security benefit when I retire in a year or two or three, or maybe I'll be like this guy and work till I'm 86. But how old are you now?
83. I'm going to be as old as Pete and Gail.
But these are amazing numbers. So if we had done this and said every young worker in America has the option of just putting 10% of their paycheck into a 401k type of plan rather than having it sent into the black hole of Social Security, every single worker in America, I'm a kind of typical American worker. I've worked, since I was 21 years old. My benefit from Social Security would not be out. My benefit will be about $2,500 a month. If I had a personal account, my benefit would be more like $11,000 a month. Every single, even a minimum wage worker, the lowest wage worker in America, would be receiving a Social Security monthly benefit of 3 times higher than what they're getting from Social Security, and they'd be able to leave $1 million to their children and grandchildren. So it was a huge mistake that we didn't do this 40 years ago, but hopefully we're going to do this soon. But Reagan had these great ideas. I mean, we wanted to privatize the Postal Service. We should have done that. He wanted to privatize Amtrak. I mean, Amtrak just keeps wasting more and more money. All of these things were really great ideas, and I hope that maybe our next president will do these things, because Reagan was a visionary. He loved to think about how we can change the whole way our government is structured, and he truly believed that government is not, one of his most famous sayings. Remember this one? Government is not the solution, government is the problem. And boy, was he right about that, and he's more right today than ever before.
Is that true of the savings and loan crisis?
What's that?
Is that also true of like the savings and loan crisis, which had to be?
Well, I'm going to say one thing about that, because do you remember in 1980, was it 87 when I think that was 1987, wasn't it, the savings and loan crisis?
I think it was earlier than that, but
86, 87. Remember the stock market crash in 87?
Oh, I do remember the stock market crash vividly, and that was
But it was a famous...
500 points in 2 hours.
Yes.
Third of the market down.
Yeah. And the reason I mention that is because everybody was freaking out, remember? I mean, that was like, it felt like it was not, 1929. Oh my God, the markets. And the one guy who did not panic was Ronald Reagan. So, and by the way, it was so typical of the press. They said, oh my God, the stock market is crashing. It's because we have these big budget deficits. This means Ronald Reagan has to raise taxes. Remember that? He has to raise taxes.
Yes, I do.
and everybody, not everybody, but many people in the White House wanted Reagan to raise taxes because it would instill confidence in the economy. And you know this, Reagan said, hell no, I'm not going to do it. And I'll never forget that there's one of the few moments I was actually in a meeting with Reagan, and I remember, many people in the White House were saying, Mr. President, Bob Dole was saying, we just have to do this for the country, and the Democrats and the Republicans in the Congress have agreed to this. We have to have a big tax increase. And I'm sitting there, and I'm kind of in the outer ring, and I'm like praying, please, God, don't let Ronald Reagan go for this deal. And everybody's trying to talk him into it. And God, honest truth, there's a long pause. He's thinking about it. He said, Bob, do you really think we need to do this? Yes, Mr. President, we have to do this. And he said, all the members of Congress want you to do this. And he said, in this great James Cagney twang, he said, well, you tell those dirty rats, no deal. And it was a great moment. And actually, I kind of jumped up in my chair, and Reagan actually looked at me, and there was a twinkle in that man's eye. So that was my great moment.
Yeah, let me just say that there was a group of people in the White House throughout the whole time that stayed really firm on taxes and on good economics, and it's represented here today. The speechwriters.
Yeah.
The speechwriters were always with Reagan all the time. The one he did when the market crashed in '87 was when he said, literally, he said, don't just stand there, undo something. And then Arthur Burns had mentioned from the PPAB that I was on, he said, Mr. President, we can get good spending cuts and everything if you'll just give a little on taxes. And he just told Arthur Burns, I love these meetings with you economists. I think it's wonderful. I enjoy it. I pretend I'm at a great, all this with all the people there. But for some reason, I made a promise to the Americans that when I ran for office that I wasn't going to raise taxes. Unfortunately, I really intend on keeping that promise. So never, ever, ever mention a tax increase in my presence again. And I've never seen him be so, he was dead. I mean, I can tell you that in 1984, there were a number of the insiders, the major insiders, not one of them recommended tax cuts. Many of them were recommending tax increases. The president asked me about Marty Feldstein's argument there, and I shouldn't use names probably today, but I'm gonna. I love Marty Feldstein. He's a great friend and everything, but I thought he was wrong in this. And the president came to me and asked me, he said, Marty Feldstein said we should get rid of the third year of the tax cut. By doing that, we'd have a smaller deficit. There'd be more capital available for private enterprise. This will bring down interest rates. It'll increase new housing starts, and it'll increase investments with lower rates. And it'll really be a boom to the economy by getting rid of the third year of the tax cut. And I said, I'm not surprised that Marty said that. And he said, do you have an answer to that? I said, well, let me see if I can reword what Marty said. If we raise taxes on workers and producers, we'll get more workers and producers. Did I get that right, Mr. President? And he said, thank you. And he was under pressure nonstop to raise taxes throughout the whole time. He personally never wavered a bit on that. It was just absolutely phenomenal. And he didn't come into this world as a tax cutter.
Right.
He did not. I mean, as governor of the state of California, he was one of the biggest tax increasers, just for the record. He was a big social spender. He chaired the Equal Rights Amendment. I could go on and on and on. But as time went on, he learned. And as he learned, he wasn't born in a manger with a light on it with the Holy Spirit. What he did was he was a human being just like all of us. And he learned and he went through the process and he created a system that really, really worked, and he stuck to his guns. I mean, the '86 Tax Act was Ronald Reagan's grand crescendo of economics. It fed, as Steve said, throughout the whole world. Margaret Thatcher lowered the highest marginal income tax rate in Britain from a 98% rate to a 40% rate. She had a phenomenal success story. I could go on with Germany, Japan. I mean, it was just, Reagan started a revolution that went through it. And by the way, Peggy, if I may say to you, your speechwriters never let him down. You guys were there all the time, and thank you very much. I mean, Ben Elliott, you, Dana Rohrabacher, God, even though you made fun of me with my one Polish joke that I once told, you guys did the best job ever. Thank you. You reported it in your book. Yeah, I know. But we'll go back on that. I thought it was just a little private joke. It was very funny.
So Peggy, were you the one who, one of my favorite Reagan moments, and you can tell me if this is apocryphal or true, but when Reagan was giving the speech when he went to Moscow State University, did you help write that speech, or that was it was in 1988. Anyway, there's a couple of speechwriters have told me this story and it's a classic Reagan story, if I may. So Reagan, puts in this, he wants to tell this joke. And, he tells the speechwriters and I think who was the chief of staff, that Baker and others, I want to tell this joke. And they kept, the powers that be in the White House kept scratching it out. Mr. President, this wouldn't be politic for you to tell this joke, da-da-da. And he said, I don't care, I want to tell it, and da-da-da. And it went back and forth and back and forth. And finally he said, look, I'm the president, I'm going to tell the joke. And you may remember this joke, it's one of my favorite ones. It's Reagan says that, a Russian woman in Moscow calls up the air conditioner, the refrigerator repairman and says, sir, you have to come over and fix my refrigerator because it's broken. And he says, okay, hold on, ma'am, let me look at my schedule. And he comes back and says, I could come to your house and fix your refrigerator in 2.5 years. And she said, 2.5 years? What are you talking about? And then she says, all right, 2.5 years. Will you be coming in the morning or the afternoon? And so the refrigerator repairman says, ma'am, I said, I can't come for 2.5 years. Why would you care if I'm going to come in the morning or the afternoon? And she says, because the plumber is coming in the morning. And that's a classic Reagan story. And he told that at Moscow State University. It was kind of a jab at the Soviet model, but it was done in a funny way. And Reagan, by the way, that's a big lesson of Reagan. And this isn't happening enough, in my opinion, in contemporary politics, which is using humor in a very effective way. The other president, by the way, who did this so effectively was John F. Kennedy. Go back and look at some of John F. Kennedy's press conferences and stuff. He was hilarious. He was very much like Reagan. And there's no accident. Those are two of the most popular presidents.
We're glad to have Peggy Noonan here with us. And she will be your hostess for the evening performance with Ben and with Carol. Ronald Reagan's farewell was not from the west face of the Capitol, but of course in the Oval Office. And he said to the American people, there were two great triumphs, two things I'm proudest of. One, the economic recovery, in which the American people created and filled 19 million new jobs. Arthur, do we see the legacy of that, the shadow of even today, that what he was able to accomplish has had, if not a total lasting effect, at least it set the pace and the standard?
Yeah, we do. In fact, let me be nerdy with you on taxes. I like taxes because I tack them and I love them. But in 1932, on January 1st, we raised the highest marginal income tax rate in this country from 25% to 63%. 1937, we raised it to 79%. By 1944, it was up to 94%. It had stayed above 63% for all that period until 1981, when Ronald Reagan took it down from that. He brought it down, as I mentioned earlier, down to 28% there. Today, the highest marginal income tax rate is 37%. The corporate rate, which was 52% when Kennedy took office, is now 21%. You look at capital gains rate, effectively capital gains on owner-occupied homes is eliminated pretty much in the US because of the exemptions, et cetera. We have brought down all of this stuff. That is the legacy. We got rid of the years of the massive high redistributionist tax rates, and no matter how the governments come in anywhere in the world, none of them can ever go against that trend. That is a permanent change that Ronald Reagan made forever. And the monetary policy change coming in with Paul Volcker and Ronald Reagan as a combination. Paul Volcker went to a price rule on monetary policy, which not allowing the balance sheet of the Fed to expand. And with Ronald Reagan's creating this huge expansion in output, we had a combination of tight money and rapid economic growth. And when you have less money and more goods available, we had a reduction in inflation that was just incredible. I think that policy, while it's not been solid forever, has been really the Reagan-driven policy. Sound money, low tax rates, spending restraint. We did cut, by the way, government spending on non-defense. We did increase defense spending, which I thought we should have back then, and we did it. But we also had deregulation, which has followed suit. And lastly, free trade. NAFTA was, after all, a Reagan creation. It didn't get passed until Bill Clinton, whom I voted for twice, by the way, just for the record. I thought he was one of the best presidents we've ever had. But it was Reagan's NAFTA that Bill Clinton put in. Bill Clinton cut government spending as a share of GDP by a huge amount more than the next 4 peacetime best presidents ever. Ronald Reagan brought it down on non-defense spending, which was the right way to go. So that legacy is here. And I think the legacy that's going to really come back, and I hope comes back in really important, is bipartisan work on great economics. There is no reason why Democrats shouldn't like tax rate reductions. There's just no ideological reason why they shouldn't. And we should get together again and create that prosperity that Reagan, through working together, was able to produce. I mean, just phenomenal record.
President Reagan said his other great triumph, he said, the other is the recovery of our morale. You in the White House, Andy, during the trying times, including 9/11, do you think there was a resilience that the United States, a greater resilience that that this country had after the Reagan legacy?
I think President Reagan, number one, helped to give us more optimistic views to carry into our daily lives when he got elected president. He was the answer to a prayer. He was an answer to a prayer. I think the performance of President Reagan and his team, including that Vice President Bush, who was truly right beside President Reagan, protecting him, advising him, helping him, and I'm going to say being a real friend. And they were very close. And I remember when President Reagan died, how upset President Bush was that he had lost such a great friend. And he never forgot how President Reagan stood with him when he was running for a very tough re-election. So it was very grateful. I do want to close my little commentary with this is a Ronald Reagan joke, and it came to me after I heard the other joke. And I remember him telling this to governors, and I don't know if Pete Wilson was there to hear it, but anyway, I remember him standing up in a small group of governors saying, you know, one thing about Washington, D.C., lots of tourists come to town. And he said there was a family that came from Iowa in town, and I kind of knew their family growing up, and they went up to Capitol Hill, and I said, go up and have a nice tour of Capitol Hill. And they went up to Capitol Hill, and they were walking into the Capitol, and then they saw Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, coming out of the Capitol, and Barney Frank was with them, both Massachusetts congressmen, and they said, there's the Speaker of the House over there coming out. And he was going to get to his car, and Barney Frank is with him, and then he turns to Barney Frank and says, oh, darn it, I left my keys in the car, and I can't open the door. Barney, run in and get a coat hanger, and I'll flip it around, and get my keys, and we can get out of here. So Barney runs into the Capitol, and he comes out, and he said, wouldn't you know it, every coat hanger has got a loop around it, and you can't get it off the bar. And they're standing around the car, and President Reagan said that his friend said, I see you've got a problem, Mr. Speaker. He says, yes, I do. My keys are locked in the car, and I can't find a way to get the car open without getting coat hangers. I can't get anything. And they said, well, you better hurry up and make up your mind because it's starting to rain and the top's down. That's how Ronald Reagan made things happen in Congress. he had enough people going in to see members of Congress saying, there's an obvious solution, you're not paying attention to it.
The president, his friend Frank Sinatra used to sing that he had regrets. I have a few, but then not just too few to mention. Ronald Reagan, in that final goodbye, said he had 2 regrets. One was deficits. Stephen?
You talking about
Deficits.
The what?
Ronald Reagan's regretted his 2 regrets. The biggest one was deficits.
Deficits.
Will we ever get rid of deficits?
You know, I think about that a lot, given that where we are today. You know, we were sweating over deficits at that time that were, $200 billion, and here we are today, running $1.5 trillion deficit. So, the problem has gotten massively worse. My own opinion is that Reagan kind of had it right. The most important thing to do is make sure you grow the economy faster than the debt. Am I right or wrong on that?
Right.
You want to make sure the debt burden is going down. And in fact, because we had, what was that number you always use, which I find spectacular, over 18 months?
Oh, yeah.
That's amazing.
Let me just, on January, the tax cuts were phased in. The first time was, the real reason we had the problem in 81 and 82 was we phased in tax cuts. Now, if you know they're going to cut taxes next year, for sure, what do you do this year? You defer all the income you possibly can, and that's exactly what happened in 81. The tax cuts began on January 1st, 1983. And it's amazing how tax cuts don't work until they take effect. And then they really work. From January 1st, 1983 to June 30th, 1984. That's 18 months, is it? Is that 6 quarters? Year and a half? In that period, that year and a half period, the U.S. economy grew by 12% in real terms. That's at an 8% per annum compound rate for a year and a half. We went from enormous economy. We won the election in 84. I'd like to tell can I tell the one story about Ronald Reagan's character? And this is a man who went from being a fairly angry man as governor, or before he was governor when he was Screen Actors Guild. He was a fairly angry, aggressive man. He was not that way as president. He was really a very loving, trying to bring the tent together. In 1984, I was on the executive committee of the Reagan-Bush Finance Committee. We had one meeting, which we did accept for public funding or not, and we accepted public funding. That was the last meeting. But as the election went along, it was clear it was going to be a radical landslide for Reagan. Reagan, about 5 or 6 weeks out of the election, pulled all the campaign funds out of Minnesota, pulled them out of Minnesota so they weren't used there. So Walter Mondale, who was a damn good guy, a very nice man. I mean, it's good. It's hard to run against God, to be honest with you. And you can't beat Reagan. But he pulled the funds out so that Mondale could win one state. And Mondale did. That was the type of decency. And I mean, that was Reagan's personal decision to do that. And how can you not just love a man and love a person who makes a generous play like that? This is a true mensch on this planet, was Ronald Reagan.
I have one more question for Stephen and Andy. You are gathered here today to honor someone who has been gone from office for 35 years, and still he's such a dominant strain, such a dominant force in America's 20th and 21st century thought. What should we all do? What should Americans, what do Reagan alums, what can we do to reinforce and keep alive the kind of Reagan philosophies that you all feel really made such a difference for this country? Stephen?
One of the things that's really cool about Reagan, and in no small part because what you all have done here at the Reagan Library, so I salute you, is that, and Peggy, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but Reagan's stature keeps rising over time. He's more popular now, and he's viewed by historians is a greater president today than when he left office. So this aura about Reagan, I don't think right now we have to worry about, oh, well, there is one big worry, and this has been a splendid party, but I do want to put a warning sign on. There is a new element of the Republican Party, and this is this new movement called national conservatism. How many of you have heard of this as national conservatism? I'm glad many of you haven't heard of it. But it's basically a new strand of conservatism that it really challenges Reaganism at the very heart of it. And it's basically an idea of big government conservatism, that we can use government as a way to promote our kind of conservative ideals. And I think that's completely wrong-headed. I think it is contrary to what we know works, which is making government as small as possible. And yet, it's taking hold in the Congress. You've got people like J.D. Vance of Ohio, and you've got people like Marco Rubio and many others that are embracing these ideas. And we need to be, so it's an anti-free trade agenda, it's an anti-immigration agenda, it's an anti-big business agenda, and many of these people are what they call the NatCons are basically saying, and they're saying this openly, the Reagan ideas don't work anymore. That's what these NatCons are saying. We have to move beyond Reaganism. No, we don't. We have to embrace Reaganism. Limited government, what is it? Limited government, free trade, sound money, less regulation. It works every time. And so we have to make sure that those people don't take over the party. One other quick thing. It's no secret that both Arthur Laffer and I have been working with Trump on economic policy, and we've met with him many times. And I just want to tell you that I'm surprised that when we meet with Trump, because Trump knows that you were Reagan's economist, he's always asking, Arthur, why did Reagan do this, or why did Reagan? He has a fascination with Reagan, which is good. He should have a fascination with Reagan, and he wants to be. He wants to have that kind of love and popularity that Reagan had, but he also wants to have the economic success. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I was struck by that.
Well, I'm an economist, and that's all I am as an economist. I don't talk about social issues. I don't talk about any other issues except economics, literally. And when you look at economics, purely and simply, you should judge people on what they do, not what they say, not how they say it. This is like a brain surgeon. You get the best brain surgeon. You don't care whether he's black or white, old or young. You want the best brain surgeon. When you want a president, you want the best person who can do the job of presidency. That's what you want for a president. Reagan was exactly that person there. And I feel the same way right now about President Trump, to be honest with you. And I don't look at any of the other stuff there. It's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, Operation Warp Speed, free to try. I look at what he did with energy, all of that stuff. These are good economics for a president to do, is my view. And look at economics.
And Stephen?
I feel people's pain very much on behavior, but it's not that you should look at. It's what they do and what they're gonna do, not how they sound or how they look.
Yeah. Well, Stephen, your mention of national service gets to the very last point that President Reagan made when he said of his regrets deficit. But the other, he said he lamented not more attention to American history and a greater emphasis on civic ritual. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is something you can pick up on President Reagan's behalf. Please thank Arthur Laffer, Stephen Moore, Andrew Card, and the Reagan Foundation for bringing this over. And there are refreshments being served up behind us here, but you have only 10 minutes to grab something because the next panel will be ready to start. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the program is about to resume. Please take your seats and turn off all electronic devices. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the program is about to resume. Please take your seats and turn off all electronic devices. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute Board of Trustees, Mr. Michael Castine.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am honored to serve as a trustee on the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library Foundation Board and have done so for over 20 years. So let me add my welcome to my former colleagues and our distinguished guests who are here with us today. In a CBS piece that aired the night of President Reagan's death, Leslie Stahl concluded, quote, "Ending the Cold War will certainly be how he is remembered most in history." If that was President Reagan's crowning foreign policy achievement, then peace through strength was his most important guiding philosophy. Peace through strength had its critics and it's created its share of controversy. But it just made sense when President Reagan explained it in his 1980 convention speech. Many of you were there. He said, "We know only too well that war comes not when the forces of freedom are strong, but when they are weak. It is then that the tyrants are tempted." So we ask, what of peace through strength today? What of the Reagan legacy? Are we heeding his example, or are we coasting on his accomplishments? As a staff member on the National Security Council, I saw Reagan's philosophy in action in real time. What was the most impressive is how he often had to defy the critics and challenge conventional wisdom when it would have been far easier to do the opposite. But, as you remember, he refused to accept the status quo. Reagan had a vision for a stronger America in the world. You recall he wanted the evil empire consigned to the ash heap of history. He got what he wanted and what the world needed. Secretary of State George Shultz observed years later, "I think in the sweep of history, you just have to say that his judgment was better by far than his critics' judgment." Secretary Shultz got it exactly right. So the question becomes, how would President Reagan judge us today? Well, I will leave that question to our panel. Guy Benson of Fox News will moderate our next conversation. It is an honor to present former UN Ambassador and Reagan Arms Control Director Ken Adelman, who is also the author of Reagan at Reykjavik, 48 hours that ended the Cold War. My former colleague and friend, Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, who served as the Director of European and Soviet Affairs on the Reagan National Security Council. Professor William Imboden, now at the University of Florida, who is the author of The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink. And K.T. McFarland, a veteran of multiple administrations, including Reagan's, and former U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor in the Trump White House. Please welcome them to the stage.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Go ahead and see it. KT, you're there. Right there.
We have enough chairs.
We do.
Otherwise, it was going to be who's, process of elimination.
We could play music chairs. One of us has to stand. Well, good evening. What an honor it is to be here. This is incredible. It's like a pinch me moment. I feel like they've mistaken me with someone else to entrust me with this panel and try to facilitate the conversation. We have so much expertise and experience up here, which I lack, with the one exception of I am a Reagan baby. I was born during Ronald Reagan's second term, just after his second inaugural. And I was sort of nervous about this. I was talking with a friend, and she said, okay, so you were born in '85. Do you think maybe a key moment in your existence may have happened the night he won? And I said, well, let me do the math. And I said, no, it might have been the convention. Then I realized I didn't want to be thinking about that. So I moved on. And so let's do the same. I would like to begin, ladies first, Madam Ambassador, with you. Just sort of a broad question. Before he was elected, there was a caricature of Ronald Reagan when it came to what his foreign policy might be. And even post-presidency, there is a public image of the ambassador, you all good? Oh, we're gonna need some extra mics. Of the president. I wonder how you feel that caricature or that image compares with what he actually did as a practitioner of American foreign policy and a wielder of power.
Great. Well, first, let me say I'm really delighted and honored and thrilled to be here this early evening. And thanks to the Reagan Library, really just appreciate the invitation. And if you don't mind, Guy, my saying, I also feel like I was a Reagan baby, but of different sorts, because I actually was in my early 20s when I worked on and had the privilege of working on the National Security Council staff. It was a real honor for me. I was there for 7 years of the administration on the NSC. So to answer your question, it's an important one because Reagan was underestimated. He was not only underestimated, but he was also maligned in certain quarters. I'll never forget looking at European press and so many articles, especially in Europe, but other places, but especially Europe, had characterized him, the cowboy is coming. What does he know? What is he going to do, the cowboy? He was underestimated, and in this sense, where did the practitioner come forward? I think he proved a number of things in rather record time. First, that, as you already did hear in the first panel, he was an outstanding communicator. He was someone who put forth ideas, and he not just only put forth ideas, but ideas that he acted on. He also had substance to him in the sense of a framework, a vision. He was indeed a visionary. He was consistent in being anti-communist. He was consistent in terms in foreign policy of speaking about the need to defend freedom, democracy. He also believed very fervently, and this was a key element relevant to your question, he was someone who believed fervently in collaborating with like minds and partners. And there, in the case of Europe, well, we know the story of his relationship with Margaret Thatcher, but I also want to put in the mix Helmut Kohl. Margaret Thatcher, definitely, but also Helmut Kohl. Chancellor Kohl was someone who he worked with, and so you had Thatcher, Kohl, Reagan, and of course we're going to hear this evening also with Prime Minister Mulroney in Canada. So how crucial it was that he had these partners that worked together, that were of like mind and felt it was important to go forward. I'll mention one last point here. One of the areas that I worked on at the time of the beginning of the Reagan administration, and so going to that point of where he was being challenged as to how he was going to handle tough issues, you had the imposition of martial law in Poland. And I'm mentioning this because I remember very distinctly, Reagan was very definitive, and when he made a decision, not only did he make a decision, but he stuck with it. And in this, he gave a speech that was one of the most emotional speeches I remember, and kudos to the speechwriters in this. It was how he appealed to all Americans and also to the globe at large. Light a candle in the window, and we want freedom in Poland. Light a candle, and he appealed to all to do that. At the same time, he imposed economic sanctions. He also worked with the Pope and the Catholic Church in ensuring that humanitarian aid got through to those in need and who were deprived of assistance. He collaborated, of course, with tough-minded, the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, in this, as well as some other European leaders. And finally, he also ensured that Poland was punished in the sense that here it was, its most favored nation status was taken away, and also it wanted to become a member of the IMF, and those actions were taken against them, and sanctions were imposed against Russia. I think he showed his mettle right from the beginning, and it changed. It really changed, not only then, but also, as we've heard in the earlier panel, in terms of how he's measured. He's measured as one of the most popular presidents. His statements and speeches are reiterated, like peace through strength. So in that sense, as a practitioner, he was underestimated, but he's someone who has enduring policies.
And KT, part of the underestimation came from this idea, oh, well, he's just an actor. And he's, you know, he's handsome and he talks well, but he's not a serious person.
He's not a heavyweight.
And
right.
one of the areas of ridicule, frankly, was around his really grand vision of Star Wars. It's science fiction, it can never happen. Yeah. What is he doing? And I know that you want to address that part.
Okay, so here's the thing. There were, in the foreign policy, national security world, there were two sort of fundamental rules that everybody learned, and you never deviated from those. The first was that we had a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and that was a whole lot better than a hot war. And that this Cold War would go on for infinity. We would never be able to, we either had a whole Cold War or a hot war, but nobody was ever gonna win this war because a hot war would have meant a nuclear war, and nobody wins a nuclear war. And no war means we would have conceded. Well, Reagan looked at that and says, I don't like either option. We don't like a hot war, we don't like a Cold War, and that's when Reagan said famously, my plan for the Cold War, we're gonna end it because, you know, we're gonna win and they're gonna lose. Well, the whole foreign policy world said, oh God, he just doesn't understand, he doesn't realize, he doesn't know how to do it. And so he then flipped it all on its head because peace through strength never meant what a lot of people thought, which was only military strength. For Reagan, peace through strength meant all aspects of national power and strength. So we've heard from Art Laffer what peace through strength meant in the economic sense. We dominated the world economy. In addition to that, peace through strength meant a Reagan military buildup. And in addition to that, it meant that we would use our superior technological ability to really shut down technology to the Soviet Union. I mean, when Reagan came into office, in the Soviet Union, they didn't have Xerox machines. Xerox machines. I mean, they were using mimeograph machines or carbon paper. They didn't have even something as fundamental as a Xerox machine. What Reagan did was systematically go through to achieve the Cold War victory, where there were about 8 different steps that were taken. 1, shut down their access to American technology. 2, Reagan defense buildup. We can challenge them on the defense field and on the spending field. 3, shut them out of the international banking system. So the Soviet Union could never borrow money in the international banking system if they had to. The next plan was help our allies rebuild their military, particularly our European allies. And then when he had all the ducks in a row, two things happened. The Soviet Union had two back-to-back poor harvests. So they couldn't feed their people, they had to borrow, and they couldn't borrow in the international banking system. And so they were stuck. And then the final thing that made all the difference was the Star Wars speech. So the second rule in foreign policy, international security, besides you're going to have this Cold War forever, the other rule was what was called mutually assured destruction, MAD. Now what that meant is we've got nukes, they've got nukes. How do you prevent a nuclear war? Well, you know that you can each have a gun, loaded gun to each other's heads. So if the Soviet Union were to attack the United States with nuclear weapons, even if there was not one American left, there would be enough nuclear weapons to then attack the Soviet Union, and vice versa. So you never start a war because you know that it's mutually assured destruction, MAD. Reagan didn't like that at all. So the final part of his we win, they lose was the proposal of the Star Wars system. So Star Wars at the time, there was President Reagan was approached by by Dr. Edward Teller, Nobel laureate, and with the idea that maybe technology had changed so that the United States could actually defend against nuclear weapons. We didn't have the technology, but President Reagan, working very quietly and very secretly with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the the American Science Advisor, and Dr. Teller, started coming up with a plan that maybe we could put a shield over the United States. We could defend against nuclear weapons. We could get away from MAD. So there was a speech Reagan was going to give in March of 1983, and it was part of the Reagan defense buildup. At that time, you know, as the previous panel was saying, that there was a lot of interest in like cutting, you know, we need to start raising taxes, we need to start cutting government spending, and Reagan wanted to really shore up the Reagan defense buildup. So he was going to give a speech from the Oval Office giving all the arguments of why you have to stay the course in the Reagan defense buildup. I wrote the first draft of the speech because in those days, you know, if it was about technical stuff like military stuff, you'd have it come from the Pentagon. Well, Reagan, so I wrote a great speech that nobody remembers because the really great lines were written by Reagan himself. And he put 2 paragraphs in this speech where he challenged the scientific community to come up, long time, it might take a long time, but to come up with a way to defend against nuclear weapons. So there he kicked the foot out of the second main tenet of national security policy. He was going to destroy mutually assured destruction. So he gives the speech. I was privileged to be able to be in the Oval Office while he read the speech. After the speech, he had invited some scientists and military guys, there were about 40 of us, and everybody nobody kind of met each other, people had heard of each other, but they all started talking about, you know, Reagan said, maybe we should think about this thing in the future, this Star Wars system. They weren't calling it Star Wars, but listening to the scientists talk to each other about, okay, what would we need to do this? Okay, there are probably 5 key technologies. We need robotics, we need laser capabilities, we need miniaturization, you know, to maybe have a space launch system of zapping the red nukes. Anyway, the next morning, the New York Post had a headline. And anybody read the New York Post? You're all Californians, you probably don't even know what the New York Post is. Okay, the New York Post has fabulous headlines. You don't even have to read beyond the headlines. So the next day, after Reagan's Star Wars speech, which we were insisting that people should call Strategic Defense, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, the New York Post has Reagan's Star Wars plan to zap red nukes. And therefore, it was born that it would be called Star Wars, which to this dying day, Reagan never really liked. But what happened was that we didn't know how we were going to build this nuclear shield, this missile shield. We knew we would have these potential component parts, and we knew the Russians had better lasers, we had better satellites. But what happened was not what Reagan really anticipated. What happened was that the Soviet Union, now remember, 2 bad harvests, kind of no more money because they're spending everything on defense, can't borrow money, shut out of the technology. The Soviet Union, the Soviet leaders, and we didn't know this really until after the Soviet Union collapsed, but they said to each other, Jesus, we don't know if the Americans can do this, but we know we can't. And we are spending 20% of our budget on our defense. There's no way we have a nickel more to spend on a Star Wars system. So Reagan, by going against the conventional wisdom on on mutually assured destruction and on the forever Cold War, was able to actually win the Cold War and change the world.
Ken, I think if you ask the average person on the street, quote Ronald Reagan with something that he said accurately, I think by far, the most prominent, prevalent answer would be, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. You've, of course, written the book on the relationship that they had in that key summit. What was it like really behind the scenes, those two world leaders, as Reagan was poised to actually win this Cold War, which people didn't think was possible, he knew different, and how does that play into his ultimate legacy?
Yes, and thank you, Guy. And it's wonderful to be back at the Reagan Library. And thank you, David, and thank you, Fred. Joe and Drake invited me here several times before, and I told well, I thought they were wonderful, stories about Ronald Reagan, and had just a good time. It was so meaningful because, as Pete Wilson knows, and Rick Burt and Paula know, our time in government was terribly, terribly exciting. You're in the spotlight, and all of a sudden you leave government, and you're no longer in the spotlight, and there's some legacy of, speaking of legacy, people coming up to you. 3 months after I left government, the day after Gorbachev left Washington, D.C. after signing the INF Treaty, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. Someone came up to me 3 months later and says, "Boy, you look awfully familiar." And I was all proud, and I said, "Thank you." Yeah. She says, "Didn't you used to be somebody?" And I said, yes, I was somebody. She says, "I thought so." And so, you leave government and, you served as well as you could. I want to do a little something different here, Guy, and I want to use a technique of Ronald Reagan and talk about his legacy. That's what this whole conference is about, his living legacy. And I want to do it using a tool because what he did in 1983, he gave a speech, and it was cheapened to call it the Evil Empire speech, because the speech wasn't about the nature of the Soviet Union. He had given that speech before, he would give it again. That's not what was on his mind. What was on his mind in Florida with the evangelicals was about courage, and it was about moral clarification, okay? And his critical part was to beware the temptation of blithely declaring yourself above it all, and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong, good and evil. Okay? When you think back 40 years and think, what is the foreign policy issue since Ronald Reagan that is the defining issue of right and wrong, good and evil? It has got to be U.S. aid to Ukraine. Here is Russia invading Ukraine, now has destroyed over 50% of the power generation of Ukraine. The New York Times just did a study showing that if Manhattan was bombed the way cities in Ukraine have been bombed, it would have destroyed every building in Manhattan 5 times over. You saw in Bucha that people were lined up like the early years of the Holocaust, shot in the back of the head. Now you have hundreds of children taken from their families, sent to Russia, with changing their names, being raised by Russians as little Russians and kidnapped, absolutely. So you have the absolute clarity of the good and the evil. And what happens? Well, in February, over half the Republican senators vote against aid to Ukraine. including Lindsey Graham, who, as Pete worked with in the Senate, Lindsey Graham was the hawk of all hawks. He was McCain's best friend. He went around the world saying we're soft and soft, okay? He votes against aid to Ukraine. And how does he explain it? He gives a salad bowl of words that make no goddamn sense at all. Last month in the House of Representatives, you had the majority of people in the House of Representatives waving Ukrainian flags, and the majority of Republicans vote against aid to Ukraine. I'm just so glad that Ronald Reagan isn't around to see something like that, because this is the clearest issue since Lend-Lease in 1941 that kept Britain alive, basically, where the Soviets were, where the Nazis were taking over Eastern Europe. And why did this happen? It happened because peace through strength that all of us know and love just hasn't happened in the Republican Party. They've given up on the Republican Party. What's happened was Ronald Reagan, as Paula, you made very clear, he worked very closely with Kohl and with Thatcher and, you know, with the parents of you guys who we're going to hear from later, and he loved the Western democracies. Donald Trump doesn't. He doesn't like the democracies. What he likes is he likes Putin. He likes Xi. He's very smart. Xi is very smart. When Putin took over some part of Ukraine in 2014, Trump said, well, you know, that's very smart. He got all that territory, and he just took it. He's smart. And what did Trump say? He fell in love with Kim Jong-un from North Korea, the most barbaric and awful leader. Well, Ronald Reagan, and we've said it, and you said it, Guy, very nicely, Ronald Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And if I may put a plug in for my book, Reagan at Reykjavik, when Reagan was sitting there at Reykjavik with Gorbachev in a little room, he said these things right to Gorbachev's face. He said, you know what, I get opposition all the time. They write about me, and I don't like it very much, but you know, when you get opposition, you send them to jail. He says that right there. And he says, you know, the difference between freedom and totalitarian, and he really put Gorbachev, and you can see the notes in my book, the notes, both the Russian notes and the American notes, you think, whoa, that is really something, but he just said it right up there. So you're right, Guy, his most notable comment is, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. To me, the most amazing comment from Donald Trump is, Russia can do what the hell it wants to NATO countries. I don't care. And he said that, okay? And it just hurts on the legacy of foreign policy that I think that if Trump, God forbid, gets elected again, I think NATO will be gone, to tell you the truth. And I don't think it has to be that we get out of NATO or diffuse NATO. It's not how things work. I think what would happen was that basically he would say and signal, and everybody would know, that he's not going to enforce Article 5. He's not going to do anything to protect NATO countries. You know, they can all, buzz off, and Russia can do whatever the hell they want on NATO countries. In foreign policy, in a way that, breaks my heart to see these things, you have a conclusion that John Lehman, who was really a powerhouse in the Reagan administration, served awfully well. And Pete, you must have worked with him because he was Secretary of the Navy, and you have so many Navy facilities around here. John Lehman wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, aside from Peggy's article, in which John Lehman's first sentence was, he's one of the very few foreign policy mavens of the Reagan administration that's still vertical. Well, thank you, John, but some of us are still vertical here. And the title of his article was, Reagan would never vote for Donald Trump. And his paragraph said, Donald Trump is no heir to Reagan's legacy. He is an insult to it. Okay. All right. I understand. I understand you don't like this, okay? But let's have Ronald Reagan's courage. Let's have the courage that Ronald Reagan advocated, that to see the difference between right and wrong. And if I'm telling you something, if I'm telling you something that's not true, tell me it's not true, okay? Did a majority of Senate Republicans vote for aid to Ukraine? Did that happen? Or that doesn't make any difference? Okay, that doesn't make any difference.
So, point.
Okay.
Made. I want to bring the professor.
Okay, fine.
Because
I got more to say.
I'm sure you do. So, Professor, we did hear in the last panel, and this is one of the critiques of the movement of the conservative movement away from Reaganism on the economic front. There is a push there. There are some people who will argue that the current, whatever you want to call it, Republican Party or conservative movement is abandoning or at least straying somewhat away from Reagan's peace through strength approach. I wonder what you make of that and just the importance, the lasting importance of Reagan's legacy that's still with us and still with the Republican Party of today.
Thanks. Thank you, guys. So I think it's first important to appreciate Reagan in his own time, which is he was also part of a divided Republican Party that was primarily divided over foreign policy. Right? So these divisions that the GOP is going through today are, in that sense, nothing new. And this is where I'm picking up on what Katie and Paula and Ken had all said in different ways. I think I can draw these together. Through the 1970s, most of the Republican Party was embracing the Nixon, Kissinger, Ford détente view, which is that the Soviet Union is a rival nation state to be contained and managed. Right? They didn't want to surrender. This was not really a policy of weakness. I don't want to be unfair to it, but they didn't envision the possibility of defeating the Soviets. Right? That was just inconceivable. The Soviet Union had always been there and was always going to be there. And Reagan, with his insurgent campaign in '76 and then his victory in 1980, has a very different vision, not just from Nixon and Ford, but from every previous Cold War president, going back to Harry Truman, who had all seen the Soviet Union, again, as a rival to be managed and contained. And Reagan reverses that, and he has a very new theory of the case that he first brings the Republican Party around to, and then eventually he brings the rest of the country around to, but it was very controversial at the time. And that is that the Soviet Union is not fundamentally a rival nation to be managed and contained, it's a vile idea to be defeated. And so that's what he means by we win, they lose, which is that the United States and the free world can prevail and that the Soviet Union can be defeated. It can cease to exist because it was fundamentally a wrong idea. And as he reframed the Cold War as that battle of ideas, and that's where it brings in that moral clarity, which Ken was talking about. In hindsight, we can see that this was brilliant and it worked wonderfully. And I think he was fundamentally right. But we need to remember at the time, this was very controversial within his own party and especially with expert opinion. Most others thought this is inconceivable. The Soviet Union, we now know it had that sclerotic, broken economy. At the time, people knew it was kind of inefficient, but no one thought that it would actually collapse. At the time, the Soviets had the strongest military in the world, stronger than the American military, and it was, thought that we're in a state of permanent decline, and Reagan envisioned the possibility of rebuilding our military to be stronger than the Soviets, but not just numerically stronger, but smarter and more lethal than them as well. And so it took that fundamentally different theory of the case, and it took presidential leadership. And eventually the party came around to support him. Eventually public opinion did. But in his first few, certainly as a candidate in his first few years in office, he was a lonely voice in the wilderness there. And even, many of his own staff weren't sure about this new theory of the case. And so I think in that sense, it's a great case study, not just in strategic foreign policy leadership, but also how one can move and persuade public opinion and bring the public around. And that's where if we see, and I'll close with this, I'm glad you brought up his iconic phrase, tear down this wall. wall. And the second most iconic phrase people most often associate with him is calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. And Ken was reading from that speech. And those are wonderful turns of phrase, but they contain multitudes. They're not just punchy lines of the campaign trail. These are brilliant strategic insights. And if you read all of his foreign policy speeches in sequence, and I did in the course of working on the book, so you don't have to, right? But if you do, you'll see that it's a sustained, sophisticated argument he's making about the illegitimacy and evil and malignancy of communism and the virtues and the superiority of the free world. And I keep on talking about the free world because it wasn't only just about the United States for him, it's about the United States and our allies and keeping faith with them as well.
KT, you've worked under 4 Republican administrations over the course of your career. I wonder what you think President Reagan learned from his Republican predecessors and what his successors learned from Reagan.
That's a great question. I think that the interesting thing about Reagan is because he wasn't a Paul, he wasn't from the Washington think tank world, because he hadn't been in Congress, that he was able to, because he'd been a businessman and a labor leader and a Hollywood actor, he was able to look at the wholeness of American foreign policy and understand that the economic weapon was our ace in the hole. And when Bill just said, at the time, in the late 1970s, the thought was that the Soviet Union was going to be forever, it had a strong economy. I mean, Nobel laureate John Kenneth Galbraith said in 1979 that the Soviet economy was far superior to the American economy, yada, yada, yada. And that was the prevalent view at the time, that the Soviet Union was so strong because it had a full employment economy, it had a planned central economy, and it was going to be, really do better than sometimes the United States did, especially the United States in the late 1970s, which had stagflation, our economic crises. The genius of Reagan was he understood the Soviet Union had only one thing they sold to the world, which was oil and natural gas, maybe some weapons, but oil and natural gas, and that they needed high energy prices to pay for their government. It paid for everything else because, nobody bought who bought Russian cars, right? Nobody. And so Reagan understood that if you take away their income, you could bankrupt them. And ultimately, we won the Cold War. The good speeches, all the other things, but because we bankrupted the Soviet Union. And here's how it happened. There was a man he was the number 2 guy at the CIA, General Vernon Walters, really tall guy. And he was a friend of the King of Saudi Arabia. So General Vernon Walters was dispatched to go to the desert, talk to the king, and say, would you please pump more oil? It's not in your economic interest to pump more oil because the price of oil will go down. But you will get the eternal friendship of the United States if you do. So the Saudis pumped more oil, and the price of oil went from $40 to $18 a barrel in 9 months. And it cut the Soviet Union's revenue stream in half, because something like 80% of the budget of what really made the Soviet Union work was oil exports. And so by cutting their budget in half, with all the other things that Reagan had set up, with the technology, with the United States military buildup, with Star Wars, with our allies, with shutting out the Soviet Union access to the world banking system, that was the crunch. And so when you look at what happened before Reagan, people didn't really understand the economic argument. Maybe FDR did with Lend-Lease in World War II. But nobody really thought about it because, they think tank guys, government guys, who just, increase the deficit, more spending. But Reagan understood that you could bankrupt your adversary and you win, not by going to war. So that was how you win the Cold War without firing a shot. Now, what is the legacy going forward? I don't want to get into a Donald Trump argument here, but there is a certain sense that by having energy prices be at $40 a barrel, which they were at the end of the Trump administration, and they're now about $100 a barrel, that what that extra money has done to our adversaries is give them a bankroll again to use, in the case of Russia, to invade Ukraine, and in the case of Iran, to go there. But I think that the lasting legacy of Reagan should be that use the economic weapon. That's what we're really good at.
So, Ambassador, You mentioned the importance of alliances in Reagan's mind, and there's iconic photos of him huddling with certain world leaders, and we have Thatcher family represented here, we have the Mulroney family represented here, you mentioned Helmut Kohl. You also mentioned the Pope, which I think a lot of people know something about, but others may not know how close that relationship was, or at least how strategic that relationship was. I wonder if you could just give us a few more insights into his personal relationship and how much that mattered with some of those other world figures.
Absolutely. Ronald Reagan's relationship with the Pope was grounded certainly in the importance of the human spirit in terms of freedom. And even in to your last question, it relates to the Pope. I think what really distinguished Ronald Reagan and where he and the Pope really joined forces was this anti-communism. The Pope knew what Poland had undergone and wanted to see Poland free again, to be able to have its independence. Reagan, from his days in Hollywood and when he was involved in labor, he writes about it, about how he saw forces that he did not like. And when he came into the White House, he was very committed to democracy and human freedom. And I would say it was very important, this kind of moral clarity, this battle of ideas, because we were in the midst of the Cold War. Remember that? And you're either on one side, as he called it, the evil empire, you're on the other side. And he felt very strongly, well, so did the Pope. It was grounded in religion, in values, in terms of the importance of human dignity, and they really joined forces. There was such a camaraderie that was very significant. And I think guided the relationship for both men in different ways. If I may also add, on Poland, the Pope's own thinking, his own involvement and inspiration, and the hope that he had provided for the Polish people and for Solidarność at the time was crucial to Reagan. And this is where they joined forces. Let me also mention, and let's not forget, the Reagan Doctrine. I mentioned it earlier, but the Reagan Doctrine was absolutely crucial. Crucial in terms of comparing him to what was before and also after. Why? Because it's the Reagan Doctrine that actually did speak about providing assistance to those kinds of resistance movements that wanted to have their own human and fundamental freedoms. And so in this sense, the foundation, the values, that foundation of values is what really drew both the President Reagan, and the Pope very, very much together. I have one last footnote here, and that is, I think that what's important here too, to remind ourselves about Reagan. And there's something, Ann Compton, you asked about, well, what is it that really we could do? Reagan had not only statements that are enduring, like peace through strength. We hear that to this very day. There are many policymakers who use it over and over. And in a way, the very essence of the administration is enduring and what inspires people. We can remind people of those ideas and reiterate them, and particularly for younger generations. I'm very proud to, by the way, be a professor in the Academy, the Civic Education and Democracy Academy, under the Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C. And why this is important, because these very values and what Reagan said has to be enduring for that next generation, and that's a place and a space in which that can be advanced through education and the importance of such critical programs that have been launched, and of which, Fred Ryan, you are spearheading, and David here, your education team is also advancing.
Can I just jump in? What she just said is really important about the power of ideas. And you mentioned it in passing when you first started talking, Paula, about what Reagan said to the Polish workers. this is an important story that absolutely is not going to be in anybody's library, right? You're not going to ever see it here in Tufts unless David gets really smart and puts it here. Reagan gave a speech to the AFL-CIO in March 30th, 1981. And Reagan personally put a paragraph in that speech. And Reagan was saying, you know, I was a member of a Screen Actors Guild, and I'm a labor union guy like you. I totally, you know, we get it. But he wrote a paragraph in that speech where he said to the Polish people, he said, you have the right to protest, you have the right to an equal wage, you have the same rights as all men and women around the world. It was an impassioned 2 paragraphs about the right of the Polish workers. No American president had said anything about this, ever. The only person who had spoken on the international stage was the Pope. Reagan said those two paragraphs, and nobody paid attention, because half an hour later, Reagan was shot. So the whole news cycle was all about the Reagan assassination attempt, and nobody heard it except the Polish workers and Lech Walesa and Solidarity. They remembered that Reagan had said, we're with you, we are one with you. And that power, that idea, as you've just talked about, made all the difference.
Also, I will just add, if I may, no, I do have my mic. Thank you.
They've turned mine off.
But thank you. I was going to say that the others who do remember, and it was significant for Reagan, again in terms of his relationships with some who you might not ordinarily think he would have paired up with, or they paired up with him, Lane Kirkland of the AFL-CIO, who adored what Reagan was doing in Poland. And these forces, these multiple forces, those who we were aligned with, then of course the Pope, and then the AFL-CIO, it was very significant, and it certainly did lay a foundation for showing him as a very effective leader, practitioner, policymaker. And I have just one fast, and that is, I do want to mention Jeane Kirkpatrick, because President Reagan brought in Jeane Kirkpatrick. And why I want to mention Jeane Kirkpatrick to all of you is, you know what he loved about her? She talked about, I want to take off the kick me sign for America. She said, we have to stand up for America. We're exceptional. And he was a proud American. And that other point about Ronald Reagan's 10-year leadership, I think, is an important aspect to remember.
Professor, on the theme of resisting communism, today's fight, of course, is not against the Soviets. It is and will be against the Chinese Communist Party. I wonder how you feel about Reagan's experience when it came to the CCP in his day in the 80s, and how some of the lessons of his foreign policy should be applied today as we stare down this next evil empire, if you will.
Yeah, sure. And I want to pick up on that guy, but also with the bridge from the really important points that KT and Paula were making about Reagan's support for Voices for Freedom, and this will come back to China in a second. So political and religious dissidents, especially behind the Iron Curtain, particularly within the Soviet Union, saw Reagan as their champion. They didn't have voices, and so he became a voice to the voiceless for them. And one of my favorite vignettes about the evil empire speech, which was, of course, is derided and mocked by respectable opinion and the elite media at the time that he gave it. But a few weeks after he called the Soviet Union an evil empire, word makes its way through Pravda and through smuggled newspapers to a prison cell in the Soviet Gulag, and that's where the famous Jewish dissident Natan Sharansky was serving a 6 or 7 year sentence. And Sharansky says that when he learned that the American president had called his government an evil empire, he was overjoyed, and he felt more hope than he'd felt in years in prison. And he tapped out in their primitive prison Morse code, signal to his the adjoining cell, telling them, the American president called our leaders an evil empire. And he said shouts of joy start erupting throughout the prison, right? And so they finally felt someone knows our plight, someone is willing to speak with moral clarity and the truth about this evil regime under us. One of my favorite exhibits in the museum, I've gone through the museum here dozens of times, but you always learn something new. One of my favorite exhibits is the Human Rights exhibit, profiling a number of the prisoners of conscience. It includes this wonderful kind of 1/4 inch by 1 inch scrap of paper on which 11 imprisoned Soviet women dissidents, led by the poet Irina Ratushinskaya, had written a congratulations note to Reagan on his re-election in 1984, and it's essentially saying, you are our champion, you are giving us hope for freedom. And it was smuggled out for, took a few months to get it smuggled out to him. And Reagan was very touched and moved by this, but it also let him know that even if, editorial pages of the United States were disparaging his harsh rhetoric, that the freedom fighters, the voices for freedom, the courageous dissidents behind the Iron Curtain were being encouraged by it and emboldened by it. And they were part of his strategy to put internal pressure on the Soviet system. So what's this mean for China today? To step back, part of Reagan's strategic genius in the Cold War was most previous presidents had primarily located the Cold War within Europe. And, Europe was the epicenter for it, especially in a divided Germany. Nixon, I had, earlier said that Nixon, I think, had the détente framework wrong, but Nixon got something right, which was trying to bring China more into the American orbit to bring pressure against the Soviets in the East. And that was a part of expanding the chessboard. Reagan took it further. Reagan truly globalized the Cold War. He thought, all right, if we're going to isolate the Soviet Union, we want them to feel pressure on all their sides. And so he brought Japan in as a very important strategic partner for the United States as part of an overall strategic revolution that he did in Asia. Sure, Japan had been our ally before into the 1970s, but they were primarily an economic rival. And Reagan, by managing the trade tensions, standing firm for free markets, not getting into a protectionist trade war, transforms the U.S.-Japan relationship from primarily economic rivalry to primarily a strategic partner. Japan tripled its defense spending under Reagan to bring a lot more pressure on the Soviets in the Soviet Far East. Okay? And then Reagan supports democracy, transitions to democracy in Taiwan and South Korea. He is very firm on supporting Taiwan, especially on their military and defense needs against possible aggression from China. And so he's very sophisticated in how he managed the relationship with China, keeps him helping put pressure on the Soviets, but he also is not going to give them carte blanche to make an aggressive move against Taiwan. Because ultimately for Reagan, our most important allies in Asia were the democracies, and he wanted more of the democracies and saw them as part of this battle of ideas against the Soviet Union. And that's what's missing today in our contest with China. I think the United States, and I'm very hawkish on China, and I supported a lot of President Trump's hard policies on China. I think President Biden has done a reasonably good job with China as well, certainly compared to other aspects of his foreign policy. But what they both have been missing is still treating it as primarily an economic challenge and a security challenge, and not seeing that it's a battle of ideas as well, right? And there are plenty of religious dissidents, imprisoned pastors, imprisoned priests, political dissidents in China who are not feeling that support from the United States right now, who don't, who want a free government for themselves, who hate the oppression they're getting out of the Chinese Communist Party, right? When Xi Jinping puts his head on his pillow at night, his main worry, what's keep him up, is not so much his fear of the United States, it's his fear of his own people, right? That's why he spends untold billions of dollars investing in the most pervasive, massive surveillance state in human history, can control and monitor every thought that his people are thinking, right? But we, as the freest nation in human history, that's an advantage for us. Why aren't we doing more to exploit that? Why aren't we giving him more sleepless nights being afraid of his own people, knowing that the United States is supporting them in their aspirations for freedom?
Ken, you mentioned you have all sorts of great Reagan stories through the years. Is there one personal story that you have, an anecdote about him that you think exemplifies who he was as a person and what his legacy means?
Well, I think what his legacy really started on the first words he gave as president. It was a terribly exciting day on January 20th, 1981. For the inauguration. Rick Burt and I and others had been involved in the preparation for it. I got buttons for my jacket that I still wear and have transferred all the time. And I was terribly excited about the inauguration. My parents flew in from Chicago, a brother flew in from North Carolina, a sister flew in from California. We decided to do a black tie dinner that night, and so we had the Cheneys over for dinner, we had the Rumsfelds over, the Carlucci's, and Gene Kirkpatrick, and had the dinner there. And at 4 o'clock, while we're setting the table, I got a call that the hostages had been released a half hour after Reagan took office. Carter had called in the afternoon for Reagan to see if he could use a plane to go over to Wiesbaden for the hostages, and the Reagan team wanted somebody to go with them, so they asked me to go. And I'll tell you, one of the coolest things in my life was to leave my own black tie dinner that night with all these people in our little house in Arlington and go off to Wiesbaden. That was a really cool thing. But what Reagan really exemplified for me on that exciting day was, and Ann Compton started to read it, but it's really quite remarkable, his first words as president, okay? And I know, KT, you don't want to get into the Trump stuff, and all my shouters out there should get ready because I'm going to go into the Trump stuff, so get ready to shout me down. Yeah, I'm quoting Reagan, so you can boo Reagan. Reagan's first words as president. You may not like it, okay? This is Reagan's first words as president of the United States. And I hope I don't break up on this. To a few of us here today, this is a solemn and most momentous occasion. And yet in the history of our nation, it is a commonplace occurrence. The orderly transfer of authority, as called for in the Constitution, routinely takes place, as it has for almost 2 centuries. And few of us stop to think how unique we really are. In the eyes of many in the world, this every 4-year ceremony we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle. Well, now we realize that we can't just assume that there's going to be a peaceful transfer of power. Okay, if you're against a peaceful transfer of power, I understand. But you know, that's not the Reagan legacy. Shame on me to read Ronald Reagan's first words as president? I mean, okay, Reagan, you don't think anything happened on January 6th? Was
So
okay,
folks, all right.
Okay, I read Ronald Reagan's first words as president.
And I think they speak for themselves, and I think that they are powerful words, and I'm glad that you did. We only have about 6 minutes left.
Okay.
So one of my colleagues who
all the shouters can sit back now.
So my colleague, Brett Baer, I've had the privilege of serving on his panel on Special Report fairly regularly.
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm really lucky, I'm sitting in the place where Dr. Krauthammer used to sit.
Yeah.
Krauthammer, I will point out, was a Mondale speechwriter in his younger days. And he came around, I think it's fair to say. And so that is one of the highlights so far of my career, being on that panel. And sometimes when it's a very busy news day and there's all sorts of hell breaking loose, and he knows that the whole panel is loaded for bear, he won't even ask a question. He will just say your name, and you can just go wherever you want, which I always appreciate. So in the 6 minutes that we have left, I know there's probably a few pent-up things that each of you has to say. If we can keep it brief, if possible. Professor.
All right, we've talked before about Reagan's humor and also framing the Cold War as a battle of ideas, so I'll just close with 2 of my favorite Reagan jokes, right? Both of which are delivering an important point here. First one, Reagan says, this is to illustrate freedom of speech, right? He says, so I'm talking to Chairman Brezhnev, and I'm trying to explain to Chairman Brezhnev what it means to have free speech in the United States. I said, Chairman Brezhnev, in the United States, someone can stand on Pennsylvania Avenue right in front of the White House with a bullhorn and scream at the top of their lungs, Ronald Reagan is a bum and a no-good president. And Reagan says, and it's fine, nothing will happen to him, he's not going to be arrested. And Brezhnev says, oh, Mr. President, you don't understand, we have the same freedom in the Soviet Union. Reagan says, what? And Brezhnev says, sure, someone can stand in the middle of Red Square with a bullhorn and yell the same thing. All right, okay. All right. the second joke, all right, and this one is with apologies to the previous panel, which had a couple of wonderful economists on it. Reagan also liked to tell this one about the challenges of a managed economy, a command economy. Brezhnev is presiding over one of those iconic military parades in Red Square, right? And he's got a foreign visitor there, a European head of state with him. And, you know, the T-72 tanks roll by, and the MiG-25 fighter jets fly it over. And then the goose-stepping Red Army goes by, and the armored personnel carriers. And it's an incredible display of Soviet military might. And then finally, you know, the SS-18 missiles come rolling by too, right? The largest ICBMs in the world. And then at the end of the parade, a kind of beaten down old bus comes along and stops in front of the reviewing stand, and out of the bus step out a bunch of people like me, actually, a bunch of professors, right? And they're kind of, you know, they've got the suede patches sewed on their sport coats and the scraggly beards and the slide rules and that kind of stuff. And the foreign visitor turns to Brezhnev and says, "Who are they and what are they doing in this parade?" And Brezhnev says, "Oh, that is a bus full of economists. You have no idea how much damage they can cause."
Ken.
I just want to give my shouters out there just some last thing to think about that we're talking about, and we're here. It's the lasting, the enduring legacy of Ronald Reagan. And I think when you go through the library, and they do a wonderful, wonderful exhibit, and you talk about Reagan's legacy, and people talk about his decency, and they talk about his values, and they talk about the peaceful transfer of power, and they talk about how he loved the military, and we're going to see that tomorrow. And we now have to me, a Republican Party that is just very, very far away from the Reagan legacy. So my last point would be, and you know, you can beat me up afterwards, and listen, I can do a million Reagan stories, and I've done it here when the library was open, and I had a lot of fun. But that's not the subject of our conference here, and this is an important moment, okay? The Republicans are about to nominate for the third time. I don't know any Republican that's been nominated third time of the party, but the Republicans are about to nominate for the third time somebody who I think, my opinion, has nothing to do with the Reagan legacy. And I'll leave you with one last story. We were very close to the Cheneys starting in 1970. We worked with them, and Liz Cheney was Carol's special assistant for 3 years. And, Liz Cheney said at one point when they were talking about establishing the January 6th committee, and Kevin McCarthy said, you know, we just don't want to do that, and he gave all kinds of reason. And in his office, he had a big picture of Ronald Reagan, and he just wanted to shut everything down. And Liz Cheney said, "That's nothing that Ronald Reagan would do. That's nothing that my father would do." And Kevin McCarthy says one of the honest things he ever said, "It's not their party anymore. You have to understand that, Liz." And I believe that. I don't believe that it's Reagan's party anymore. And it grieves me a lot.
We're up against the clock. KT.
That's it.
There was a Republican
You need
primary debate.
You need this.
Oops, gotta have the mic. Okay, there was a Republican primary debate. I don't know if it was the one here, but anyway, it was for 2016. And to show you how beloved Ronald Reagan remains, there were about I covered it for Fox News, and there were about 6 of the candidates who were on the stage, and each one of them kind of made their way over to me at one point or another and said, so Marco Rubio says, "You know, I know you used to work for Reagan. Don't you think I'm Reagan's heir?" And then Rand Paul came over to me, and he said, "Well, I know you wrote the Weinberger Principles of War. Don't you think I really am Ronald Reagan's heir?" Yeah. And then, anyway, ad seriatim, each one of them came up. They were all very different personalities, very different sort of messages they wanted to make. But the amazing, enduring thing of Ronald Reagan is that every single one of them is convinced that he's Ronald Reagan's heir.
Last but not least, Ambassador.
One quick point just on something Will said, because I think you'd be interested. He mentioned Anatoly Sharansky, now Nathan Sharansky. By the way, what I wanted to add, he had the opportunity to meet President Reagan in the Oval Office. He was released from the Soviet Gulag, and he actually told Reagan directly, "Your words, your speeches inspired me and gave me hope. It gave me hope to go on." And I really wanted to connect that because he was released. He became Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, by the way. I will tell a personal story which has humor in it. So when I was working on the White House National Security Council, and the National Security Advisor at the time was, many of you Californians would know this name, Judge William Clark, who was the National Security Advisor. He would bring NSC staffers into the Oval Office. So I got the call early in the morning, and it was Judge Clark saying, "Paula, I want you to come and join me today to brief President Reagan on Poland." So I'm thinking, oh my gosh, okay, I'm going into the Oval Office in the morning, we're gonna talk about Poland. So I get into the Oval Office, and you have the names you're familiar with. You had me, Spaker, Deaver, they were there, as well as the Vice President, George H.W. Bush. So the President comes in, and he goes, "Good morning, everyone. You know who was with me yesterday? Was Miss America. And you know something? We had a great meeting. She gave me something that I want to show all of you." So all of us are wondering, what is it? What is it? He says, "Look, she gave me this business card. I'm going to use it. See, it says, I'm Mr. Everything. Isn't that great?" And he said, "But you know, there was a little problem. And you know what that is? I flipped it over, and it has all these qualifications, but it doesn't have 3 things that I know that I am: sensual, sexy, and foxy." So he definitely knew how to use humor.
And on that wonderful note,
and my briefing went swimmingly after that.
panel, thank you so much, and we'll see you at dinner in just a moment.
Well done.
Thank you to our panelists. I think it's worth recalling when President Reagan opened this library in November of 1991, he said, "It is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future." We've had a very rich discussion over the course of our 2 panels. It is important to have these conversations, and once again, we saw today how Ronald Reagan's legacy, characterized by a spirited advocacy for economic opportunity, for freedom and democracy, peace through strength, how all those principles guide and inspire the policymaking here and abroad, and with tremendous impact long after President Reagan left the presidency. So a special thank you to each of our panelists and moderators for making today's program so special. It is now time to move to our Air Force One pavilion for dinner and our keynote fireside chat. Staff will escort you to the pavilion. We are starting the program right away, so please don't delay in your movement over to dinner. Thank you very much.